The train screeched to a stop beneath the labellied clouds of Stillwater Ridge. Dust rose from the tracks like ghosts, curling around the boots of a woman who stepped down with care, holding a burlap sack to her chest and a rolled oilskin bundle. Beneath her arm, her dress was clean but worn, the lace at her collar yellowed from the months it took to reach this place. Inside the oilskin was a torn wedding gown, folded with the gentleness of someone who still believed in what it once meant. Maria Langley glanced around the empty platform. No name was called, no sign held up, just the hiss of the engine and the shifting of distant cattle. Then a voice, thick and sour, barked from a nearby wagon. "You the girl who came for the cooking job?" She turned cautious. A man with red cheeks and an untamed beard sat slouched over the reins, a jug tucked under his elbow. His eyes barely met hers. "Yes, sir," she said softly.
"I'm Maria Langley."
"I was hired. Don't care what your name is. Get in." He didn't offer a hand. She climbed up awkwardly, the wooden seat slick with dust. The horse turned with a tug, and they rode in silence through cracked fields and wind-chased weeds. The sun dipped low behind them, casting long, thin shadows that seemed to reach out for her feet. The ranch came into view as the light fell. A big house, white once, now gray with weather. Its porch sagged in places, curtains fluttered behind. Crooked windows, no laughter, no dogs, no children. Jed, she learned his name when he cursed it under his breath, didn't knock. He pushed the front door open with his boot and hollered, "Letty, got your new kitchen mule?" Inside, the walls were thick with smoke and silence. A woman with sharp eyes and a tighter mouth came around the corner. Her apron was clean. Her hands were red from lye. She looked Maria up and down and said only, "You'll be up by 4? Breakfast at 5? Dishes by 6? Maria nodded, setting her bag down near the stove. No room was shown. No welcome was offered. It's just a wooden chair in the corner and a dented kettle to fill. She unpacked the oilskin, bundle quietly tucking the wedding dress in the bottom of a cupboard no one used. A private rebellion hidden under rusted pans. That night, her hands raw from scrubbing the hearth, Maria sat near the fire, trying to warm the ache out of her fingers. Lump formed in her throat. She bit her lip to stop it. Still the tears came silently, falling onto her apron as she stared into the flames. A hand struck her across the cheek. "No crying," Letty hissed. "We don't have room for softness here."
"Oh, Maria."
Didn't speak, but didn't flinch again. She lowered her gaze and pressed her fingers to the sting. Letty left without another word. Outside, on the porch, a man sat in the dark. He hadn't said a word since she'd arrived. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hat low over his face. He held a tin cup of coffee, untouched, cooling in his hands. His boots were planted firm on the floorboards, like he'd been carved there long ago. When Maria looked through the curtain, she caught his eyes. He didn't look away. He didn't speak, but he didn't blink either. Just the sound of the wind moving the rocking chair beside him, gently, as if remembering someone who once sat tea. Morning came gray and thick with wood smoke. Maria had already stoked the stove, her palms blistered from hauling logs. When Letty's oldest son, Earl, stomped in, sniffed the air, and sneered, "Burnt again." She hadn't even poured the coffee, yet the house breathed hierarchy. Letty ran it like a quiet battlefield, rules unspoken but razor-sharp. Her sons swaggered through the halls like kings who inherited cruelty. Earl and Jasper, one older, one louder. They watched Maria, not as a person, but a thing. A body to serve, a mouth to keep shut. Maria learned to move quietly, to shrink herself between walls. Her name, spoken rarely and only when scolded, began to feel like a coat too big for her shoulders. She didn't recognize the sound of it anymore. One morning, the old tin coffee pot slipped from her fingers, cracked hard against the stone floor, and hot grounds spilled across her skirt. Earl stood without a word, crossed the room, and struck her in the ribs. Not hard enough to break, just enough to bruise. Just enough to remind her of where she stood that night. After the dishes were dried and Letty's knitting needles clicked behind closed doors, Maria stepped out to breathe. The moon hung behind shifting clouds. The barn glowed faint with lantern light. She moved toward it without thinking. The The door creaked open. He was there, Colt Maddoxon, an old stool beside a worn saddle. He didn't startle, didn't even lift. His hands were polishing the wood of a rifle, the motion slow and precise. Round him, the space was orderly in a way the house never was. Saddles cleaned, lanterns trimmed, boots polished and lined like soldiers at attention. On the far wall, nailed above a folded blanket, hung a braid of chestnut hair tied with blue ribbon. Below it, a photograph scorched at the edges, two people on a porch, their heads bowed close. Together, a wedding picture half burned. Maria's breath caught. He didn't look up, but he knew she saw. She didn't speak. He didn't ask her to leave that night. She scrubbed her hands raw in the kitchen basin, thinking of the way he had cared for that gun, the reverence in his touch, the braid, the way it swayed with the wind from the open barn door. In silence, he had offered her more humanity than anyone in the house. Colt Maddox, she'd overheard Letty say once, was her late husband's brother, a soldier. Came back from the war with something broken in him. Stayed in the barn because he wouldn't take orders and wouldn't give any either. Just worked. And watched Maria lay on her cot in the pantry, wrapped in her shawl, listening to the distant rumble of thunder. Something was coming. Maybe rain. Maybe something else. But for the first time, when she closed her eyes, she didn't feel entirely alone. Someone else in the dark had scars too. Maybe that mattered more than words ever could. The storm arrived the way old dogs die slow, mean, and full of groaning. Wind bullied the shutters loose, and the rain came hard against the rooftop tin like stones thrown from heaven. Maria sat, curled in her thin shawl, on the floor beside the stove, watching a steady drip form above her bedroll. Water slid down the cracked plaster, soaked her blanket, and ran cold into her boots. No one came. Letty had long gone to her feather bed. Earl and Jasper were drinking out in the shed, hollering above the thunder. Maria pressed her knees to her chest and tucked her skirt beneath her. Her shoulders trembled, teeth chattering as smoke from the hearth hissed under the damp air. Her cough returned, thin, dry, hollow. She covered it with the edge of her apron, unwilling to make noise that might call more trouble. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da by the time. The sky began to pale. The room was cold as a crypt. She must have dozed in her damp clothes. When she stirred, she found something warm folded beside her, a quilt. Old but clean, heavy with the scent of leather and pine. Beneath the stove, a tin plate had been left with a lid over it. Still warm eggs, bread, and a half slice of smoked meat. No note. No voice, just evidence that someone had come and gone. While she slept, she looked toward the porch, saw the door swinging just slightly. Outside, Colt Maddox was already hauling water, his back to her, his long coat soaked, but his steps steady. That afternoon, the storm passed, but clouds clung low, like they'd forgotten how to leave. Just before supper, hooves stirred dust at the edge of the main road. A small group of Ute riders appeared, calm but alert, riding in with dignity instead of fear. Their faces were still unreadable, and the horses wore woven blankets across their flanks. Letty's boys stumbled to the porch with rifles, drunk on pride and whiskey. Earl stepped forward, cocking his Winchester. "This is our land," he shouted. "Ain't no treaty keeping you here now." Maria froze in the kitchen doorway, a towel still in her hands. The riders didn't flinch. They waited. Colt appeared from around the barn, walking slow, no gun in sight. He moved between the Utes and the boys like a shadow drawn long across the ground. His hands were empty, but from his coat pocket, he drew out something small, flat, and carved. He held it up high enough to catch the light, a circular token, worn with age. Silence. One of the riders nodded slowly, eyes never leaving Colt's. Then they turned their horses around and left without a word. Earl shouted something after them, but Colt didn't respond. He stood until the dust settled. Later, Maria saw the token laid on the windowsill beside the coffee tin, pattern carved into the metal, half sun, half horse. She said nothing. But that night, as she swept the hearth, she paused by the stove and refolded the quilt. She placed it neatly on the rocker outside the door. It rocked once, twice in the wind. She didn't know what made her feel safer, his silence or his shadow. Maybe both. He hadn't said a word, but he'd protected her in the storm and them. All from fire, not with a bullet.
Oh, but
With something older than war. The days stretched longer as spring settled in over the hills. The garden that had once been choked with frost and weeds began to respond to Maria's gentle hands. She knelt in the dirt with her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back in a kerchief, humming half-remembered tunes from a life that now felt far away. The potatoes began to sprout. The hens grew calmer when she scattered feed. Even the gray mare, long deemed too skittish, let her brush its coat without turning away. She started to breathe easier in small moments, when the kitchen stayed quiet after supper, or when Colt passed by the garden fence and tipped his hat. Ever so slightly. It wasn't friendship, not yet. But it wasn't fear either. Then came the moment that cracked something wide open. She was setting biscuits on the cooling rack when Earl stormed in, red from whiskey and sun. He slapped the pan aside, sending the bread tumbling to the floor. "You think you're somebody now?" he growled, grabbing her by the wrist. His fingers dug into her skin. "You're here to serve. You don't get to smile." Maria stiffened, heart racing. Her other hand reached instinctively for the counter, bracing for the hit. Then another voice, low and slow as thunder from far off. "Let go." Earl turned his head. Colt stood in the doorway, hands at his sides, eyes fixed. The room went still. Earl scoffed, shaking Maria's wrist harder. "She yours now?" Colt said nothing, stared. Something in his silence made the threat heavier than any shout. He muttered a curse and backed away, slamming the door behind him. Maria didn't speak. She touched her wrist gently, the skin already rising. Colt met her eyes just long enough to say it mattered, then turned and walked out. That night after, the dishes were done and the windows shuttered. Maria opened the cupboard and pulled out the old oilskin bundle. She unfolded the wedding dress, still torn along the hem, still delicate where the lace met the bodice. She shook out the dust and carried it to the porch. The wind was soft. She laid the dress over the railing, letting it catch the evening air. The fabric lifted, fluttering gently, like wings too tired to fly. She didn't notice Colt at first. But when she turned, he was sitting on the top step, elbows on his knees, watching the fabric move. The firelight from the kitchen window caught the silver in his hair. She stepped closer, slow, and said almost a whisper, "My name's not just Maria, it's Anna Maria Langley. Folks back home called me Annie." Colt's gaze didn't waver. He nodded once. She waited, as if expecting something more. A word, a gesture. But he stood instead, left the porch without a word, and disappeared into the barn. She thought that was the end of it, until she stepped out at dawn and found his coffee cup placed carefully beside the dress, a fresh ring of steam still curling from the rim. Not forgotten, left. She folded the dress again that morning with care, hands steadier than they'd been in months. The wind tugged at her shawl as she carried it inside, but she held tight. For the first time she felt seen, not for what she'd done or hadn't done, but for who she was, and someone had listened. The gunshot came like a lightning strike out of silence, fast, sharp, cruel. Maria had just banked the fire and was wiping flour off the edge of the counter when it cracked through the walls of the house. A moment of nothing followed, then voices. Rose shouts tangled in drunken rage. She grabbed her shawl, hard in her throat, and rushed out the door. Rain had started again, light but steady, tapping on the porch roof like nervous fingers. In the distance, near the storage shed, she saw him, Jasper Letty's youngest, stumbling through the mud with a rifle slung over one shoulder and arms full of supplies. A sack of beans burst open, spilling like gravel behind him. "Jasper," she called, "stop! You'll get yourself killed." He turned to her, red-eyed and wild. "Don't tell me what to do, girl. You think you're better than us now?" "You can't take the food," she said, stepping in front of him, arms spread. "It belongs to everyone." He dropped the sack and raised the butt of the rifle like a club. She flinched, bracing for the strike, but it never came. Colt was there. silent as ever, but not slow. He grabbed the barrel in one hand and wrenched it clean from Jasper's grip. With his other hand, he shoved the younger man back hard. Jasper slipped, fell in the mud with a groan, and Colt didn't wait. He pinned him down, tied his hands with a length of cord pulled from his belt, every motion practiced. Final, cold as old iron. Letty came running, her voice shrill over the wind. What in God's name is going on? He laid hands on her, Colt said, low and final. That was all. Letty stood stunned. Maria didn't speak. She watched Colt drag Jasper through the yard and lock him in the barn, like a dangerous dog who'd finally bit the wrong hand. Hours later, after everything had quieted and the rain had washed away the shouting, Maria found Colt sitting by. The stove he wasn't eating, just staring into the flame like it was telling stories only he could hear. He poured 2 bowls of stew, sat across from him. They ate in silence for several minutes before she spoke. Have you ever struck someone before tonight? He looked at her then, eyes tired but clear. Not since the war. She nodded. I'm sorry it came to that. He made the choice, Colt said. Finished it. His voice had a steadiness, too. It like weathered wood, split but strong. She stirred her spoon, watching steam rise. Your wife. Right. She began softly. Was she kind? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something. Wrapped in a handkerchief, he set it gently on the table and opened it. A braid of hair, pale brown and still glossy despite the years. Bound with a blue ribbon, faded nearly gray. She braided mine too, he said. Night before I left for the war. Said she wanted to remember the part of me I never showed. Maria stared at the braid, her throat thick. Right. She must have. Loved you. She was braver than I ever was, he said. They sat quietly, firelight dancing on the wood floor. Outside, the rain softened. Maria hesitated, then reached out not to touch the braid, but to rest her hand near it. If you want, she said, voice almost a whisper, I could braid it again, to keep it from unraveling. Colt looked at her, not surprised. Not moved in any big way, just seen. A breath left his lungs slow and steady. He nodded. No smile, just the weight of memory, passed from one pair of hands to another. Later that night, as she washed the bowls and folded her shawl, Maria looked at the quilt still resting on the rocker, now warmed from the fire through the wall. For the first time since she arrived, the house no longer felt like a prison. Out there was something alive here now. It wasn't just the fire. Letty stood in the kitchen doorway like a shadow that had waited too long to move. Her voice, when it came, was dry and sharp. She goes, she's brought nothing but trouble. My sons, your sons made their own trouble, Colt said. Maria froze by the stove, her hands still wrapped in the drying cloth. Letty scoffed, stepping into the room. She's not family. She was brought here to cook. That's all. Colt turned from the window. He didn't raise his voice, didn't take a step closer. But the silence that followed him was thick. She stays, he said. Letty blinked. She cooks for me, he added, and I call her my wife. The word hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Letty's mouth opened to argue, but no one else backed her. Looked at the table. Jasper was still bruised and quiet, hunched by the door like a dog who'd been whipped too many times. No one spoke. No one moved. Maria couldn't breathe. Later, alone in the pantry, she packed her things with trembling hands. She didn't know what Colt's words had meant. Kindness, protection, a stand against Letty, or something more. The torn wedding dress went into the sack last, folded around the still warm coffee cup he'd left that morning on her. Windowsill. She stepped out just as the first light of day broke over the ridge. The fence line waited like a decision. 8 held her bundle close, every step away from the house a question. Then she heard boots behind her. She turned. Colt stood a few feet away. One hand closed around something small. He looked different in the dawn, less worn, more real, like a man stepping forward instead of backward. He held out his hand. In his palm sat the braid of his late wife's hair, now tied around a thin silver ring. I don't want to trap you. He said, you don't have to marry me. Maria stared at the braid, then up at him. "But if you leave," he said quietly, "I'll ride with you." She didn't say anything. Her eyes filled before she could stop it. Not from fear. Not from pain, but from being chosen. She reached out, her fingers brushing the braid, then the ring. Her other hand found his wrist, steady as cedar. "I've walked too long alone," she whispered. "I'm ready to ride." He didn't smile. He just nodded once, then turned toward the barn. They left as the sun rose to horses saddled, two figures cutting across the land like wind carving through cotton fields. Behind them, the ranch stood still. Letty watched from the window, her mouth a hard line. No one else came out to wave. No one dared. On the porch, two rocking chairs sat untouched. The old quilt was folded neatly over one. The other held nothing. But Dus Maria didn't look back. Colt didn't once, just enough to make sure. The past was behind him. And then they kept going. Toward land that didn't have names carved in anger. Toward its quiet fields and warm kitchens. Toward something real.